Okay, I want to talk to you at this time about something that may sound a little bit on the complicated side, but I think you'll find that once we dive into it, it really isn't all that difficult to understand. Have you ever heard the concept paradigm juxtaposition? I mean, just to say that is a little bit of a mouthful, but I'm wondering if that's a concept that you're familiar with. Uh, and we'll look at both of these terms, but basically, paradigm juxtaposition is the idea of comparing two things for the purpose of showing the distinctions between them. You'll see here a beautiful picture of a tree on a sunny day, evidence of growth and life, the green grass around, and all of that. Uh, but if you want to present a juxtaposed idea to your listeners and compare them, then you might want to show this side of it. In contrast to life is death. In contrast to sunshine are clouds. In contrast with green grass is cracked, dry clay. And so this would be an example of juxtaposition, placing two normally contrary ideas or pictures or people or whatever it is together in order to draw out the contrasts. Now, paradigm here refers to something a little bit more specific. Just juxtaposition in general is putting two things together. But why paradigm juxtaposition? Well, let's define the word paradigm. Paradigm is basically a model of how things are or should be. For example, if you're studying a language, you might be able to even go back to the back of the language book and find an appendix full of paradigms showing nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs, carefully categorized in the back. And that would be a form of a paradigm. A paradigm shows how things are supposed to be or how they should be ideally. And I'll give you some examples of paradigms in just a moment. To juxtapose, as I've already mentioned, is to place together in order to create an interesting effect or to show how things compare. Now, in the picture that I showed you, really it's more of an artistic effort just to create an interesting effect. But you could use that to talk about the difference between a rainy season and a dry season, for example, in a country like Brazil where we lived. We experienced very good rainy seasons and very dry and hot dry seasons. And I could use a picture like that to tell the story of what it's like to live in Northeast Brazil. So a lot of ways you can use paradigms. All right, you're probably wondering, how does this relate to what we're talking about in sharing the gospel of Christ? Well, the idea of worldview comes in here. The way that people see things, especially things that are in contrast, is going to depend on their worldview. How you view good and evil, for example, is going to depend on your worldview. Do you see it as involving spiritual activity, or is it merely an evolutionary idea? You see, your worldview is going to tell you that. When you see people of different ethnicities, how do you view those people? Well, if you're a racist, yeah, you'll have one way of viewing them. But if you believe that God created them all from one race, an Adam, then you'll see them in a different light, and so on and so forth. Maybe cats and dogs would be another good one. If you're a dog lover but you hate cats and you put the two together to compare, you're going to have one way of seeing them. But if you're a cat lover and you can't imagine life without a cat in the house, and you put a dog and cat together, you'll see it in a different light. So worldview, point of view, has a lot to do with it. Now let me give you some examples of paradigms that you may consider when you're thinking this whole thing through. And some of these are statements that you probably have heard before. Others may be new. I threw in at least one or two that kind of date me. They come from an era back when I was just a kid. Now, you probably know this one: do to others as you would have them do to you, right? Right out of the mouth of Jesus. Interestingly, Confucianism says something similar, but in a contrary way. Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. In fact, you could even view that as a way of juxtaposing those paradigms on the one hand, the positive side, do to others as you would have them do to you. On the negative side, do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. Now, I'm not trying to make Jesus and Confucius equals. In fact, I would juxtapose the two of them. And remember talking about Confucianism, he's thinking more about a purely human approach to life. And Jesus, of course, shows us the need to have the power of God at work in our lives. Here's another example of a paradigm. You only go around once in life. Get all the... Now, this one you may or may not recognize. There was a beer commercial on when I was a kid, and I don't even remember which beer company it was, but the word they stuck in that blank was gusto. You only go around once in life. Get all the gusto you can get. And they were trying to convince you that if you didn't drink beer, you've missed your chance. You only have one life to live, and here's a chance to really live it up, and you don't want to miss the opportunity. All right. So here's another one. The grass is always greener on the other side. Exactly. And we've all heard that one. And of course, the idea behind that is wherever you are in life, there's always a tendency to look at somebody else as having it better than you do. Here's another one. If you want a job done right, and this is one that my dad used to say quite often when he would get frustrated with us kids. If you want a job done right, do it yourself. I can hear him saying that sometimes as he tried to get us to figure out how to do something and we just weren't getting it. But that's another paradigm, that some people will live by. The best way to make sure something gets done right is to do it by yourself. How about this one? The chickens come home to roost. And the idea behind that is basically the idea of Galatians 6:9. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. Sooner or later, you will bear the fruit of what you sowed. Another way of saying that is what goes around comes around. Same idea. There will be consequences eventually. Here's another paradigm. Make hay while the sun shines, right? Here in Iowa, that one should be very well known, living in an agricultural farm community. And the idea behind that paradigm is don't waste your time. Take advantage of the time that you have to get things done. How about this one? There's no free lunch. And that is just a simple way of saying there really is nothing free in the end. Even if a company says, oh, you buy this and we'll throw this in for nothing. Well, they're not really throwing it in for nothing. It's all calculated in the original price, or there's something coming down the road that they're going to want that's eventually going to pay for this free thing that they're giving you. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so, again, that paradigm is simply saying, let's be real about life. And people will sometimes try to paint something as being, just incredibly true, unbelievably true. And more often than not, it's not. And there's some string attached. So all of these are examples of paradigms. The way that life works. They're sayings that people come up with to describe different aspects of life and reality. Okay? Paradigms, models. Now, what we're going to do next is take a look at a very specific application of paradigm juxtaposition. And we're going to use the example of a neighbor to do this. We'll get it started here, and then we'll finish it up in the following lecture. So if I say the word neighbor, everybody listening conceives in his or her mind of what a neighbor is. Is a neighbor someone who lives next door to you? Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one idea. Is a neighbor another country that is bordered to your country, is connected to your country? Well, yes. Canada is our neighbor, and Mexico is our neighbor. All right. Can neighbor be somebody that you work with at the office? Yeah. He or she is in the next cubicle, my neighbor at work. And of course, Jesus wanted to make the point that a neighbor was anybody with whom you had some sort of meaningful contact. So let's take the word neighbor and develop it. All right. So just reviewing what we just said, what is a neighbor? Be somebody next door or whatever. What is a good neighbor? All right. Well, that's a question. A good neighbor is somebody that keeps his dog inside and doesn't let it do its job on your lawn, or doesn't let it bark all night. A good neighbor keeps his grass cut. A good neighbor doesn't pile a bunch of junk in his front yard. A good neighbor keeps his tree trimmed so that the branches don't fall over on your side of the fence. A good neighbor is somebody that will be there to help you when you're in need. And a good neighbor keeps his area looking nice and tidy. So, lots of ways you can describe a good neighbor. And of course, you may be familiar with the State Farm commercial that says, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. And so the concept there is that a good neighbor is somebody who's there when you need help. What's a bad neighbor? Well, pretty much the opposite of everything we just said. A bad neighbor is somebody who allows the dog to run through the whole neighborhood and do what it shouldn't be doing in your yard. I remember when we moved into our home where we're living now, our neighbor came to me and said, yeah, the previous neighbor during the wintertime had his kids, sledding down on my side of the yard and making a mess of my lawn, and so, his idea of a bad neighbor was somebody that intruded on his property without permission and, kind of messed up the pretty snow or whatever, something like that. A good neighbor takes his trash cans in after the garbage truck goes and doesn't leave them sit out there for the next 3 days. A bad neighbor may be somebody that's always yelling at his kids or fighting with his wife, and you can hear him, even outside. So a lot of definitions of a bad neighbor. How should I treat my neighbor? Well, there are many ways to answer that question as well. You may treat your neighbor by taking care of your own yard and house, or you may treat your neighbor well by offering to help when they need help. Maybe there's been some sickness in the family, and so you offer to come over and cut the grass, or to water the flowers, or something like that, or shovel their driveway in the wintertime. I've seen that happen over and over again. We live on a cul-de-sac, and we have some elderly people that live there on the cul-de-sac. And after a heavy snow, I'll look out, and there's one of my neighbors out taking care of that couple's driveway for them. And sometimes we'll do that as well. And so now, one other question: what is my responsibility to my neighbor? Now, I want you to notice here that something like this can be useful in drawing someone into a gospel conversation. The purpose for creating this paradigm of a neighbor, a good neighbor, is because we're working our way to the gospel. When you start asking what a neighbor is, what a good neighbor is, and so on, what you're really doing is preparing someone for a presentation of the gospel message that this paradigm leads into. So when you get to the question, what is my responsibility to my neighbor, all of a sudden your mind as a Christian probably goes to the Good Samaritan. And that's exactly the purpose of this illustration. Choosing a paradigm like a good neighbor, State Farm is there, or whatever, choosing that kind of a paradigm gives you an opportunity to enter into the gospel. Now, why is this a good paradigm to use? Because virtually everybody has neighbors of some sort. Very few people live completely alone, isolated in a neighborhood someplace. Even if they do, they work with people, they go to school with people, or they shop with people, or they go to church with people, or whatever. And so the idea of a neighbor is pretty much a universal given for just about everybody. And so you can take an example of a neighbor and use it as a way to enter into a gospel presentation. And so what I do in my class here at the college is I have my students divide up into groups and have a little fun. And in the next lecture, I'll show you what kind of fun we have.